everybody, to Max Rice tonight. Today we got a special guest, Jason Bedrick, former House of Representatives in New Hampshire and Policy Director of Ed Choice. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, first question. You were in the House of Representatives. You ran 3 times, lost the first election. Second election, you won by 6 votes. Third election, you lost by 1 vote.
That's right.
Which one was tougher of the 3?
You know, none of them were really tough. First time around, I didn't expect to win. I wasn't really even running to win. I was running to make a point about school choice. Second time around, was obviously super exciting, especially since I went home that day thinking that I lost by 12 votes. And then somebody called me and said, no, somebody made an error in adding some stuff up, and actually you won by 5. And then there was a recount. Not a recount and everything. We ended up winning by 6. So that was obviously really exciting. But even the loss the last time around in the primary, I wasn't sure that I wanted to run again. I had only planned on serving 1 term, and then I wanted to go back full time to yeshiva. So I was ambivalent about whether I wanted to win or not. I ended up losing by 1 vote. I knew that was the right thing. And 2 weeks later, because I had lost and went back to yeshiva, I ended up meeting the woman who eventually became my wife. So all 3, I think, really worked out for me personally.
Yeah, that's insane. The 1 vote. That's just straight out of a movie. And we'll find those 2 people. No, I'm just kidding. But so an accounting error won you the first election. And on to the important, we're kind of a transition into school, school, whatever, the importance of math.
Yeah. Well, it didn't win me the first election. It was.
It almost lost you, right?
An accounting error almost lost me the election, but it was fixed.
Was that public school or private school?
I don't know where they went, but I think it was just an honest mistake.
I'm kidding. Yeah. But in regards to school choice, I'm in Chicago, which is kind of like a battleground because we have just such poor public schools. What are kind of the arguments for school choice for the people that are kind of on the fence or don't know anything about the issue?
Look, I'll tell you why I got into school choice, and that's because, I'm the product of 8 years of public school, and then I went to, believe it or not, to a Catholic high school. I was very fortunate that my parents could afford to live in a community that had a very high quality public school. At least they had a public school grades K through 8. They did not have a high school. That's how small my town was. They used to contract with a neighboring town. The high school that I would have been assigned to was actually not as good. And I'm fortunate that my parents were able to afford to pay to send me to a private high school. But it became clear to me that if America truly stands for equality of opportunity, which really is, that's the promise of the American dream, right? It's based on equality of opportunity. There can be no equality of opportunity unless every child has access to a high quality education. And so I became attracted in college to the ideas of Milton Friedman. He, in a famous 1955 essay on the role of government in education, he made the point that, not every family might be able to afford an education for their child, which is why there's a role for the government to subsidize education. But it doesn't follow from that the government has to be the one that runs the schools. And so he proposed that the government should provide school vouchers, that every child would receive essentially a coupon that parents could redeem at whatever school they chose. Since then, that concept has been developed. There's 2 other main types of private school choice. So I'm not talking about interdistrict public school choice or charter schools or anything like that. But you've got the school voucher, you've got the tax credit scholarship. This is where individual or corporate taxpayers make a contribution to a nonprofit scholarship organization. They receive a tax credit, and depending on the state, it's either 50% to dollar for dollar. I believe in Illinois, you have I think it's a 75% credit in Illinois. You have a $100 million program. You've got a 75% credit. I think there's more than 10,000 low-income kids that are participating in that program in Illinois. And those scholarship organizations fund usually low and middle income children. Then you have the latest and the greatest, called the Education Savings Account. This is not to be confused with college savings accounts like Coverdell or 529s. The K-12 Education Savings Account, or ESA, the money follows the child, but it doesn't just go to private school tuition. It can go to tutoring, textbooks, homeschool curricula, online learning, special needs therapy, and then unused funds can be rolled over from year to year to save for future expenses. So this really gives parents the greatest freedom and flexibility to truly customize their child's education.
So we've seen like a kind of a huge rush from public school to private and even homeschooling. But I'm not seeing any consequences at the public school level. I'm not seeing any budgets being cut or any meaningful reforms to tenure or pensions or anything like that.
Is
that
the
politics or
the fear that the other side has is, this is what they say. And this, by the way, 20, 25 years ago was a legitimate concern. Okay. Well, what happens if you introduce choice? Well, the families that are the most interested in education, they're going to take their children out of the public schools and they're going to go to a private school. Now, first of all, just stop right there for a second. What does that say? Right? It says that they have very little faith in the quality of the education they're providing in the public school system, that they're afraid there's going to be a mass exodus. But let's just say this. There's going to be a mass exodus. The families that are most interested in education are going to leave. The money is going to leave with them. Now the public schools are going to be left with the hardest to teach children and less money to teach them, and the system is going to collapse and it's going to lead to greater inequity. I think that it misses the reality of inequity in the existing system, and B, it's not at all what the evidence is borne out. So the existing system is not that everybody is together and everybody is equal in the public school system. The public school system is based on geography. And we know that these schools, there was redlining, back in the 40s and 50s, that said, okay, this neighborhood over here where it's mostly African-Americans, you're going to go to this school. And then this neighborhood, which is like middle income and upper middle income whites, you're going to go to this school. Obviously, the second one is the better school. And even after Brown v. Board of Education, the public school system is still de facto very much racially stratified. Some would even call it segregated.
I would.
Yeah. And so there is incredible inequity in the existing district-based system that we have. Number two, what we have actually found is the opposite. When you introduce choice and competition in the system, not only do the children who have access to it have access to a higher quality education, but actually it even improves the system for those kids who remain in the existing system. There are 27 studies that have looked at this from top research universities around the country. And 25 out of 27 studies find a positive effect. One finds no statistically significant difference. One found a negative effect, but it appears to be an outlier. It's from Florida. And there are several other studies from Florida that show positive effects. As a matter of fact, Florida has the largest, they have the second most students participating in private school choice per capita in the country, next to Arizona. They have the single largest school choice program in the country. That's their tax credit scholarship program, where there's more than 100,000 students participating. There's another 30 or so thousand students on their low-income voucher. And these kids, the average scholarship family in Florida is making just about $25,000 a year. 70% of them are Black or Hispanic, okay? And there is a study from a local university in Florida. It's a longitudinal study that looks every single year at the participation and the performance. If you look at the students the year before they enter the program, okay, and you compare them against their demographic peers, they are performing at a lower level than their demographic peers, right? So it's not that the system is creaming. It's not that they're taking the best and the brightest, right? The kids that are doing well in the public school system tend to stay in the public school system. It's the kids that are really just not doing well. The kids that it's not that because they're dumb, right? It's because it's not the right fit. They're in a learning environment that is not matching what they need. And so those are the kids that are most likely to leave and go into the private schools. And then once they get there, after just a few years, they're performing at the national average, which is to say they are far outperforming their demographic peers. That's why if you look at states like Florida, like Arizona, over the last 2 decades, I mean, these two states with the two most students in choice programs per capita, if the critics were right that it would lead to the destruction of school choice, of the public school system, the public school systems in Arizona and Florida should have been destroyed. Instead, they're among the fastest gaining states in the country. Arizona actually, on most of the NAEP exams, actually NAEP is the National Assessment of Educational Progress that the U.S. Department of Education runs. They, on most of the tests, are actually, over the last 2 decades, the fastest gaining state in the nation, which is what you would actually expect.
So there's more total kids in school. So it's growing on both fronts, because like less dropouts, more economic success.
Right. So the public schools actually end up upping their game, right? They actually learn how to compete. You know, when students are leaving the system and the money is leaving with them, they say, okay, wait a second, like we actually have to now go talk to the families. Because in the existing system in most states, public schools are not directly accountable to the families. We've learned that, especially during the pandemic. You know, you've got all the parents clamoring, open the schools, open the schools. And the teachers union is like, no thanks. And the school stays closed because the public schools have essentially been captured by special interests, and they are not directly accountable to families. They're accountable to elected school boards in elections that are off-cycle elections where, you know, an organized special interest like the teachers unions have a really good chance of actually capturing the school board. And they're accountable to unelected bureaucrats at the state capitol. The only way to make them accountable directly to parents is to give parents the ability to take their money with them and leave if they're not satisfied with the service that their local school is providing. That's what these types of programs do, is they empower families to not just to leave, not just to have that exit option, which is really important, but it also empowers them if they want to stay, but they want the system to improve. They want the system to reform.
So because they could just say, what are you going to do about it? Move. And now they have
some. I say, yeah.
Right. What are some other reforms you would suggest for public school, or just kind of leave it alone and just have like free market design? Are there any, because I think there's some deep issues with pensions and what's it called? Tenure seems kind of concerning.
Yeah, but those are not my area of expertise. Yeah. There are massive pension problems that we're aware of in the public school system.
25% of the public school budget in Illinois.
Right. But I think a lot of the issues with the public system would actually be solved if there was greater competition. When you have a captive audience, you can get away with a whole bunch of stuff. When you don't have a captive audience, you actually have to be more responsive to the needs and desires of the people that you are supposed to be serving. And so, you know, I can't say, you know, blanket, this is what a school must do. It's going to be different in Illinois and than Mississippi and West Virginia and in California, right? Even in those states, you know, the needs of a rural school and an urban school and a suburban school might be very, very different. So that's the idea, though, is let's shift the locus of power away from state capitals, away from special interests, and to parents.
So what are because there is like a huge resistance against school choice. What are your responses to that? That you kind of already answered, like the quality of education is lower. That's just not true, right? There were like 26 studies or.
Yeah, and those are the studies that concern the effect on the public school system. There's a whole bunch of research, by the way. You should go to our website, edchoice.org, and you can find just a ton of research. Especially, there's a report that we put out called the 1, 2, 3s of school choice. It looks at what are the effects on participants, what are the effects on the public schools. And when it comes to the participants, you know, what are the effects on test scores? What are the effects on graduation rates, college matriculation? The propensity of graduates of the two different systems to commit crimes or to have out of wedlock births, or their civic outcomes, their level of civic knowledge and civic engagement, racial integration, the fiscal effects, all that kind of stuff is summarized. And these, again, aside from the fiscal effects, we've done a lot of those studies. Most of the research actually is conducted not by us, but by by universities, by research universities, and we're just compiling all of that data in one place that makes it easy for people to digest. So highly recommend checking that out. As far as the opposition, I think that the number one argument that they make is they say, well, the public schools serve 90% of children, and school choice would hurt those schools. And to that, I say the evidence is exactly the opposite. The evidence is that school choice has a positive effect on the public school system, but that fundamentally we should be funding students and not systems. The system is designed to serve the needs of students, not the other way around. And so, I mean, what the other side is essentially saying is, yes, your child may be assigned to a school that's not working for her, but you have to keep her there for the greater good. And I think the reality is, no, actually the greater good is served when every single child gets to go to the school that works for them.
Did you see the case in Baltimore where there was a person that should have been a senior in high school and was the top half of their class, but had failed every English class ever?
So I didn't see that one in particular, but I've heard a number of
that's a failure at the school level, in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we hear a number of cases like that. Oh yeah, they're a valedictorian, but they failed the state assessments. How could that possibly be?
That seems cruel and unusual, and right. The same sort of systemic racism that they kind of roll back at you.
Right. And so sometimes the other side will point out well, sometimes these private schools close down, or sometimes a charter school closes down. It's like, yes, that's great. Actually, that is a feature, not a bug, because you could have a low performing public school and it sticks around forever and it just gets more and more money. But money is not the issue. It's the lack of responsiveness.
In Chicago, we had there was a 10-year sex scandal where they were covering up, I think, over 1,000 instances of complaints. And this was in 2007 to 2017. And the next year they went on strike for more money. So I'm always just is that just kind of like the media and just dark money kind of working to do a good PR job? Because it kind of seems like teachers get a pass. Like if a police officer makes a mistake, national news, but teacher fails a student, picks on a student, bullies, it kind of.
Well, and just to be clear, I mean, the vast majority of teachers are just wonderful people that are, getting relatively low pay because they're taking a job that they're passionate about, that they care deeply about these children. The problem is that there are bad apples. And so if you have a system that is designed to protect the bad apples, you end up with more bad apples. We talk a lot about this. You hear a lot about this these days, when it comes to reforming the police and the role that police unions play in protecting the bad apples who are then in a position to do really horrific things to people, and make all of the good cops look really, really bad. Well, it's the same thing, look at, for example, in New York City, it was so hard to fire a teacher. I remember, the Reason Foundation, the Rubber Rooms. So the Reason Foundation years ago put out this paper, and if you printed it out, it would it would like a scroll that would roll all the way across the floor, right? With all the different steps that you needed to go through in order to fire a teacher. And it was so time consuming and so costly to fire a teacher. It was easier to just keep them on the payroll, but these teachers are so bad, in some cases dangerous, that you don't want to put them near the children. So they had a whole building. They called them, like you said, the Rubber Rooms. We'll just put them over there. They come in, they check in, they sit there, they read, they play chess, they play solitaire, whatever. They check out, they go home. That is not good. That is not good for the system. And it's not good for morale. And you can imagine all the people that didn't even make it to the Rubber Room, but also don't really belong in a classroom. That's what happens when you have a system that is more responsive to the special interest in the system than the people that the system is supposed to be supporting. The only way really to reform that is not just through top-down new regulations or things like that. It is actually giving those families, it's bottom-up reform. It's giving those families the ability to leave and putting them in the driver's seat.
Screw you guys, I'm going homeschool, as Cartman would say. But so to be clear, you're in favor of on the private school side, is it much easier to fire a bad teacher, bad principal if they are to the same special protections?
No, it's a lot easier in the private sector than it is in the government sector, for sure.
Interesting.
That's not to say there are no bad private schools or bad teachers in private schools or bad principals. I mean, we're dealing with humans. We're never going to have a perfect system. There's always going to be flaws. It's never going to be perfect. The question is which sector has that feedback loop that aligns incentives to lead in the direction of improved performance. That's the private sector. The private sector is in a much better position to do that than the public sector.
It seems cruel, and it seems like you're forcing like someone to lose because it could go in a different direction. That's why I implore everyone watching to just kind of think about the bigger principles and not if you're
right. That's what the public system does. I mean, when you have a government run system, you're essentially saying in a diverse society, some of you are going to get to have your values recognized and reflected in the public system, and some of you aren't. So you have to fight over it.
Yeah, like Martin Polanski Day, Yom Kippur, they got to make a decision. Who we're getting.
Right. So the only way that everybody can actually have their values reflected is if they get to run their own schools.
It seems too with learning styles too, because I've been seeing a lot of private schools open up that kind of cater to people that kind of learn differently.
Yeah, certainly. It's not. So I mean, there's, some kids. I did well in a traditional classroom, right? I liked that sort of system. I thrived in it. But there are some kids that would be much better off in, let's say, a Montessori style system or a system that is, more self-directed, not what they call, not so much the sage on the stage, but the guide on the side, where they're exploring things that, at their own pace and their own interests, and the adults are there not so much to just teach a preordained curricula, which I think is very important for a lot of children. And actually, I would say probably even most children. But for some, they might do a lot better saying, I want to go and just explore these things. And the teacher is there just to sort of guide them and show them what resources there are and point them in the right direction. So to have a system where you have a whole bunch of different options, you might have 3 kids and 2 of them fit in one type of system and the other doesn't. So you want to have other options for them.
It'd be pretty remarkable if everyone kind of had the same behavior based on like location. Just everyone on your block learned in a certain kind of way. But you were mentioning
I've got twins and they don't even, they're not even, they move at different paces. Some of them are better in one subject or another, and then it might reverse a few years later. I mean, so, kids are different. They learn at their own pace. And it's kind of absurd to me that we have a system where it's like, well, we're going to take all the kids that live in this area. We're going to send them to the same school. We're going to have them move at the same pace as all the kids that were born in the same year across all subjects. It's like, that's not how kids are. It doesn't reflect the lived reality of these children.
No. And the results speak for themselves in certain areas. But you were talking about how it's kind of, a lot of it's newer than what people think, and how I know for a fact the Department of Education was created in 1977 or 70s.
Sounds all right.
I think the budget's like $27 billion a year. Would you cut Department of Education if you're president?
Yeah, this is I don't have an exact answer for that. I am ambivalent. I would certainly roll back the Department of Education. It was passed under Jimmy Carter. Reagan talked about getting rid of it and ended up keeping it. I think it serves an important role as a clearinghouse of information and data, especially the National Center for Education Statistics. But I would reduce the funding, and I think, you want most of the funding at the state and local level. You want most of the funding directed by the parents. A friend of mine, Matt Ladner, wrote a few years ago in the Wall Street Journal. He said the U.S. Department of Education, or really the feds, the federal government provides only about 8% of the funding and about 60% of the regulations. I think you'd be better off these different states if the funding, but also the control, were at a much more local level.
So expensive strings attached, it sounds like.
That's right.
And so you might keep it. That's okay. But so what are your advice to
a much scaled down version of it, if at all?
Just the guts. What's your advice to parents that are kind of kind of being scared by what's happening in public school, just the quality of education, but maybe can't afford private school or kind of had negative like perceptions of it, what's your advice to them? Like, where should they start?
Well, they might want to start looking at our website, edchoice.org, because there may be a school choice program in your state that you're not even aware of. So that's a good place to start. There's also a good book out there by Andrew Campanella called The School Choice Roadmap, where he just talks about all the different sectors, everything from charter schools, private schools, home schools, the various private school choice programs, different types of schooling, so what is Montessori? What is classical? What are all these things? How do I find out more about them? What are the resources in all these different areas? So that's a really great resource. I highly recommend that. And you might also want to look into micro schools and learning pods. It's not a new phenomenon. It's been going on for a while, but it's gotten a big boost during the pandemic because the public schools are closed. Even a lot of the private schools were closed. Parents, especially toward the beginning of the pandemic, were like, well, I want in-person learning for my child because Zoom school is not working so well and they're socially isolated and I have to work from home and I'm having a hard time with all the kids running around and, so there's a lot of reasons I want them in person, but I don't want them in a large institution where they're spreading who knows what. So a lot of families started to look into the pods. Now, some of these pods, it was just like, this is a pandemic pod. We're going to do this until the schools open back up and then we're going right back to the schools. But a lot of families said, well, actually, this learning pod really works for my child. It's a smaller environment. There's less social pressure, but there's still, a lot of social activity. Because it's a smaller classroom, the kids get much more individualized attention. It's a lot easier. When you've got 25, 30 kids in a classroom, you kind of go at the pace of the median student, right? But when I've got 10 kids in the classroom, especially if the 10 kids aren't all the same age, they might be a variety of different ages. Some of them might be 7, some might be 12. Well, now I can sort of tailor, each child can move at their own pace in different subject. I can group them in different ways based on ability instead of based on age. So a lot of families are this is something, again, that was already going on before the pandemic, but it has exposed a whole bunch more families to this potential learning option. That might be something that you want to explore as well.
Before we leave, I want to ask also standardized testing and
yeah. So I think
and required subjects. That those are probably the last two topics.
Yeah.
Because in Illinois they want to get rid of. It's not going to happen, but there was a bill to get rid of history in Illinois. So
yeah, I am not in favor of state mandates for required subjects. I kind of trust the good sense of the American people that they're going to, send their children to a school where they're going to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic, and they're going to learn history and science, things like that. And I think most states, at least when it comes to the private sector, have a relatively hands-off approach where they say, because one of the problems with these is like you have to teach a certain amount of hours, and we want to move away from seat time and toward competency. But then, well, how do you prove competency? Well, we need a state test. My relationship with testing is somewhat complicated. Testing, I think, is very, very important. It provides information to, first of all, on the outside, people think of, to colleges or to prospective employers, but also along the way, I mean, ideally what testing is going to do, it's, instead of having one test a year, you have regular tests throughout the course of the year. It's to provide information to teachers about how well the children are absorbing the material so that they can make course corrections along the way to make sure that every child is getting the best education they can. And it should be based on competency, not just the amount of time that you sit in a particular seat. I am against mandating a state test, especially in the private sector. And the reason is because, and this is more so in math and some, especially when you get into content areas, it's less so reading tests, but, like let's say you do a math test. Well, let's say you've got a whole bunch of private schools that do algebra in the 8th grade, but now we are imposing the state test and we're testing algebra in the 9th grade. Well, those kids are going to be at a disadvantage And those schools are going to look bad. So what they're going to do is they're going to switch to teaching the test, the algebra. They're going to teach algebra in 9th grade instead, because that's when it's going to be tested. And then, right. And then there's, different concepts that you might teach in algebra, right? And so you're going to teach the ones that are going to be on the test. And there are different ways to teach it. Well, you're going to teach it the way that the test is going to, that's going to match what's the best effective strategy for the test. I would much rather, in the private sector, there are a whole bunch of different types of tests that are out there. And so a school can design a curriculum based on what they think is best for the kids. And then they choose the tests that most align with their curricula, as opposed to if you have one test, then everybody essentially designs their curricula to maximize performance on that test. It creates this perverse incentive.
So standardized is the issue.
Well, so it's not standardized, because these other tests that they're choosing are also standardized tests, right? Yeah. But it's mandating one particular standardized test that I think is highly problematic.
I agree. And I just remember like the cheating and all that going on too. And I think it's Up in the Air, the guy that wrote the book Up in the Air wrote a whole book about how Ivy League schools and that mentality is kind of in rewarding people that cheat and are good at gaming the system. But what's called edchoice.com, right?
.org, edchoice.org.
Edchoice.org, guys, is the website. Definitely give it a read through. If you're not into school choice, do the research. Test it yourself.
You can find me. I'm Jason at edchoice.org. Feel free to email me with questions, and you can find me on Twitter at Jason Bedrick.
Great Twitter and Facebook follow. Very good. You get some heated arguments on both sides, which is good, because how do you know the truth if you're in the echo chamber?
Heated but civil. You got to keep it
civil. Yeah, no name calling. The facts though can be quite interesting when someone's on the other side. But thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you for having me.
Blast. And we'll see you next week.